Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Helen.
And this is the Squiggly Careers podcast. Every week we talk about a different topic to do with work and share some ideas and tools that we hope will help all of us navigate our squiggly careers with that bit more confidence and control.
And we recently launched a new newsletter called Squiggly Careers in Action. So it's a weekly newsletter. We put the links to the podcast. We've got your borrowed brilliance, like insights from things Sarah's been reading and watching, Helen's how-to, practical tools, loads of free resources. So make sure that you sign up for that if you want to get a weekly dose of career inspiration, and also subscribe wherever you listen or watch to the Squiggly Careers podcast.
And so today we're going to be talking about 5 assertiveness watch-outs and what to do instead. We know assertiveness is a topic that always feels relevant. I think it's one of those skills that we'd perhaps all like to be a bit better at. There are usually some specific situations I think we can spot where we think, I wish I was just a bit more assertive then. But it can feel quite hard to make happen or to know how to do that in a way that feels like normal and natural for you. So you're not like trying to pretend or doing something that just feels really awkward or uncomfortable.
I always think as well, it's easy to assume that assertiveness is one of those things that you're either good at or you're not, versus a skill that we can all learn to do a bit better in the moments that matter. I look at some people and I think, well, they're just naturally assertive. They're just an assertiveness person. And it's much harder for me. So I like what we're going to talk about today. I think makes assertiveness very practical, very doable for most people at work.
So we'll briefly talk about what we think assertiveness is, so we sort of know what success looks like. Perhaps some people that we admire that are sort of assertive, and what can we learn from them. And then we're going to spend most of the time on the 5 watch-outs and then kind of the ideas for action. So when you think about assertiveness, I think maybe a common mistake or a myth is assertiveness only shows up in what we say. So I think often the first examples that we think of is, in a meeting, in a presentation, you've got other people and you're having to talk, you're having to say something, and you think, I want my communication in those moments to be more assertive. And that's definitely true. But I think assertiveness is across all of your communications. So when we think about assertiveness, it's really about how to have clarity and confidence across any communication. So that might be how to write an assertive email. That might be how to write an assertive presentation, as well as what you say.
Just in terms of like assertive situations for you, do you think you are naturally more assertive in person, in a virtual meeting, or in your kind of written communications? Where do you think you are naturally most assertive?
Oh, it's a good question. I think I'm naturally most assertive in a meeting with somebody, like in a room.
Okay, so in person, okay.
Yeah, I think that's also probably where I've had the most practice. If I think about all of my working years and what I've spent my time doing, and I'm quite a happy communicator. I'm quite happy in meetings. I think I've probably done so many of them that that's probably a bit of a learned skill. I think I've got a lot better at writing in an assertive way, and I think what really helped me with that was seeing other people do it well. So I think my emails and my written kind of work generally wasn't that assertive. It was probably too waffly, too long, sometimes like overly, like friendly, and like messages could be mixed or get lost. Then I think I worked for some people who were very good at that. And I also saw how much you appreciate it. When you're on the receiving end of assertive communications, you're like, here's a 1-page summary, or here's a really clear email. You're like, oh my God, that makes my life so much easier. True. And so I'm like, well, I want to do that for other people too. Yeah. So I think I've worked much more on that one. And then virtual ones, I think I still find quite hard sometimes.
I think I'm good at virtual now.
Yeah,
I think and we'll talk about some of the things that help me. I think in person, one of my watch-outs that we'll come on to shows up quite a lot. You know the one I'm going to talk about. And I think I could get better still at written. I think so, yeah.
ChatGPT might be your friend there.
That's true. We'll talk about some ideas for that.
So shall I summarise the 5 watch-outs?
Yes.
And then we go into each one and we'll talk about what to do instead. So the 5 watch-outs. 1, too much talking. So we associate assertiveness with saying a lot. 2, over-caveating. So all of those in-betweens and maybes and might-bes that can get in the way and cloud clarity. Number 3, all about me. So mistaking assertiveness for thinking it all has to be about what you say and lots of I-ness, which we'll talk about. 4, energy overload. So that perhaps feeling a bit overwhelming for other people rather than just useful assertiveness. And number 5, we're calling the robot risk. So almost where you're perhaps following a playbook of how to be assertiveness, but then you lose your personality as a result. And Helen and I were reflecting on these 5, and thinking about which one gets in our way the most. So which is your biggest watch out? So it's a good question to ask yourself. So Helen, your biggest watch out?
It's the energy overload. And I think my unmanaged self is just naturally enthusiastic. And I'm a bit like, I'll just bowl them over. The way that I'll be assertive is I'll just bowl them over with energy. But actually, sometimes it has the opposite effect, because it sort of disengages people or makes them overwhelmed. And so I lose that ability to bring people with me because they sort of disengage. I think if you didn't know me and if you weren't stuck with me, that would probably be the impact that I would have on you sometimes. You'd be like, oh, gosh, she's too much. She's too much. I think you probably still think that, but you can't get away from me. So I
wouldn't like to comment.
Okay, moving on.
And mine is too much talking. So I think sometimes to be assertiveness, I need to get my voice heard. I need to say what I think, and that's how people will see my credibility, or that's how I'll influence and persuade people. Because often you're being assertive because you've got something you want to share. And I think sometimes almost like where talking unhelpfully overrides listening, it actually makes you less assertive rather than more, because then I think you can feel like you are dominating discussions, so other people don't feel like they've got space, and that's not useful. But then also I might miss the point, so I might go in one direction because I'll think, oh, well, this is what I think is the right answer and I've got something to share, but perhaps if I've not done enough listening, I've missed signals that actually something else could be more helpful. So it's something I've worked really hard on, but I definitely still notice it can come up, particularly when I'm meeting people for the first time or people that I don't know.
And I've seen it in you, and I've just become more aware of it. And I actually think it's really interesting because it also challenges lots of assumptions people make about introversion.
Yeah.
Because you would identify as an introvert, and I think a lot of people might make the assumption that, introverts don't maybe talk as much or don't have that, whereas you will in situations that are new or where you're nervous talk more. And I just know that now that's part of how you behave in that situation, rather than you wanting to dominate a conversation. It's never that, it's just a reaction to what's happening. Maybe we start there with too much talking as the first watch out, and given that is the one that you identify with the most, what do you do instead that other people can learn from so that you sort of stay assertive in those situations?
So one thing I do kind of before a conversation, and I guess this for me is conversation rather than kind of written communication, is I do always think about what do I want my talking listening ratio to be in this conversation. And I do that quite mindfully and quite consciously now, not all of the time, but in those specific situations where I think I am meeting someone for the first time. And this is where it can be really useful to get some kind of data for your development. And lots of the AIs that you can plug into meetings now, because most meetings we do are virtual, will actually tell you if you're getting better at that. But you also, I think you instinctively and intuitively know. You can come away from a conversation and think, well, how much did I listen versus how much did I talk? And I feel like over the last 6 months or a year, I've done a much better job at kind of almost like telling myself to just relax and to listen. And also perhaps to let go of assertiveness doesn't always have to happen like today in this conversation in terms of me asserting myself. What I might want to do is just really listen first. And then often people say we'd really like another conversation, or they'll be mindful of we've not had enough time to hear lots from me today, but then I can do a much better job the next time. So that's just kind of one tactic I think that's worked well for me. But I think the other thing that's felt really helpful is this idea of assertive statements. So an assertive statement isn't a question, that's kind of a slightly different thing. So a statement helps you to set the direction for where you think a conversation is going to go next. And this, I think, is less about necessarily a point of view or talking loads. It's more about listening. And then what you do is the transition or the segue from listening into like where you then go. So it shows you've actually been listening. It's like a signal. So it might sound like now feels like a good time to ... So you've like listened to somebody and you're like, okay, so now it feels like a good time to decide, do we want to do more of X and a bit less of Y, or actually is Y more important to focus on first? That's quite assertive, because you're saying, we've probably done enough exploring, let's prioritise. Or it could sound like, shall we now begin by ... or why don't we start by exploring ... So you're setting a direction, you're sort of almost like gently, I think, helping to move a conversation forward. You're very quickly also inviting someone to respond to that, because you can't say those statements and then you can't answer it. Almost like the statement means you then have to listen to what the other person says. So they might say like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. And then they're probably going to share what they think. And the one other thing that I found that has really helped me is, because sometimes I think it's a bit about unlearning and relearning, letting go of the idea that being assertive means that people are always going to agree with you. I think you can show up in an email, with what you write, with what you say, in a really successfully assertive way. And that can mean that people then say, oh, actually, I've got a different point of view, or I don't agree with that. And that doesn't mean you've not done a good job, but I think I used to think it did. So I think I would maybe be brave enough to share a point of view or perspective. And then if I didn't get lots of people nodding, I'd be like, oh, I didn't do a good job. And I think you sometimes have to just slightly compartmentalise those two things. Like, getting a yes is not the same as being assertive.
It's quite a lot to unpack in what you shared about, like, assertiveness can happen over a series of interactions, not just in one moment. Assertiveness can look like listening as much as it can from contributing. And assertiveness doesn't always have to mean you get to a yes. Like, it's quite a lot within that. I think that's quite important for people to take away.
Yeah, I think what that shows already is that assertiveness is not a tick box skill. It's not something where you think, I'll do one thing equals one more point on the assertiveness scale. I think you almost have to figure out, what does being assertive mean to me, and therefore what are the actions that I'm going to take? Because I think probably what you've just heard is that's my version.
Yeah.
That's me understanding myself well enough to know when I'm not as assertive as I would like to be. And then clearly I've done a bit of figuring out of going, well, then what do I need to do differently, and how does it show up, and what are the changes I want to make?
There's some kind of matrix in it, which I cannot quite create in my head right now.
I could see in your eyes. I was like, what's she trying to do?
I'm trying to build a matrix in my mind. It's so funny. We've got a WhatsApp community for some of our very keen people on Pod Plus, and they messaged me this morning because they've been listening to a recent episode with Tasha Urich.
Oh, yeah.
And someone said on the WhatsApp message, Helen, I could hear how excited that you were getting when Tasha mentioned a 2x2 matrix. And it's so, I actually was. I was like, go matrix. And I haven't had to say it. But yeah, there's some kind of matrix. Maybe I'll try and bring it to life for Pod Plus. So the second watch out for your assertiveness is over caveating what you're saying. So this is like, maybe I'm thinking I want to come across as assertive as Sarah because I want to influence an outcome for our new book, for example. And in conversation with Sarah, what I might say is, one of the ideas I've had that I think we could possibly consider, but I know there's a lot of other ideas that you've got, so don't worry if it's not possible, but I do think it would be, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And to Sarah's point earlier about clouding clarity, that over caveating has completely clouded the clarity of my communication, because Sarah's having to work really hard to work out what I'm trying to say. And as a result, I've lost my assertiveness. I've lost the ability to say clearly and concisely, like, this is the thing that I care about. And I also think there's quite a lot of reasons why people might over caveat. They might not be confident in the thing they're trying to say, so they're sort of just almost, how I sometimes think out loud. I'm just sort of doing that. Or maybe they are nervous about how someone's going to respond. Yeah. Or I think also sometimes people worry, back to one of the assumptions we need to challenge. I think sometimes people might worry that if you're too assertive, it can sound a bit arrogant.
Yeah.
And so if they've got, a confidence gremlin about being liked or a bit of people pleasing going on, they might be softening their words so much that they're losing that clarity. They're losing the impact of their assertiveness.
But I do think you have to be careful. When you hear people say, this is probably a silly idea.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, you've just told somebody it's probably a silly idea.
Yeah, what sticks in your head then? Yeah.
Like the anchor that you've given somebody then. Or because people often, it's probably a silly question.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, probably not.
Yeah.
And so I just think actually just having the confidence to say, these are some first thoughts I've got.
Yeah.
I've got a question it might be useful for us to consider. I think it's still okay to have a might in there, because you've still got to communicate in a way that feels like a normal sentence, haven't you? We're not sort of saying get rid of all the in-between words. I think it's just noticing whether there are certain phrases that might be getting in your way, particularly probably at those moments where you do really want to be assertive. Like when you and I are chatting to each other, that I don't really want to, it's not top of my mind about being assertive most of the time. There might be moments, but most of the time. But then there might be other times where maybe you are working with someone and you are trying to be more assertive. And it's then, like it's how intentional are you, I guess.
Well, the what to do instead, if this is your watch out, so over caveating, is to use I statements. So like some of the ones that Sarah said there. So like, I think we should.
Yeah.
One thing that I want us to consider is like be very intentional about the I statements. And I think also try to say the I statement and stop. Because I think if you say it and then you keep going, then you've lost the impact of the I. So just have a really clear I statement, stop, invite someone else's perspective. And I think also the ability to stop and pause and listen is also an assertive thing to do. But a nice, clean I statement, intentionally used if you are at risk of over caveating, is one of the ways you can bring your assertiveness back in.
I found it's really worked for me to use the phrase first thoughts. I use that a lot. I will often say to, a new learning partner we might be working with, they've maybe described a bit about their company and what they want to do. And I will say, I've got 2 or 3 first thoughts I'm happy to share. And I think that feels quite assertive, but not so assertive that I'm saying this is the answer, because those first thoughts could be wrong, but I'd almost rather find out that they're wrong, but they're still my first thoughts. So I'm sort of taking a bit of ownership for those. And so I find that phrase really helpful. I also find somebody who's got conflict as a gremlin, I'm never going to say to somebody, I don't think, I disagree with that, but I would say I've got a different perspective or I've got a different take on that. And that just about feels comfortable enough for me to say out loud. So the third watch out is all about me. And I really like this one because I think this works well if you are someone who does find assertiveness difficult. Maybe the over caveating is really hard for you. Perhaps you're more of a listener than you are a talker already. You play a kind of supportive role. You're very empathetic. If you're listening and you're like, oh, you're describing me, I think this is kind of the one for you, because assertiveness doesn't have to be all about you all of the time. Of course, we want you to share your point of view. We want you to communicate with clarity. But the action here we're calling inviting others. And we think you can actually be really inclusive in your approach to being assertive by inviting other people into a conversation. And actually, when we were talking this through and we were sort of practicing it out loud as we were preparing for this is something I think I've seen in action from Helen all the time. And so it's almost easy to, it's easy to know that this works because I see you do it. And so what Helen does really well in meetings is, if somebody hasn't had the opportunity to contribute, or perhaps they started to say something, but, a few people spoke at once and they immediately gave other people space, I sort of see that you clock it. And then you will just always come back and say, oh, I think Lucy's got something that would be useful to share. Or, oh, Danielle, did you have a point of view you wanted to offer at this point? Or you'll notice my thinking face, which you seem to just always know what that looks like. And you'll be like, you're more direct to me. You'll be like, Sarah, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
And you'll just include me in that conversation. And actually you do it in a way where I feel like it is assertive, because you're sort of assertive is a bit about taking control. You're taking control of that conversation. You're making sure that people don't get left out or left behind. And you're also making space for other people. But it definitely feels like an assertive thing to do, because you have to have confidence to do this, I think. And also you have to have the sensing ability to notice. I think this takes a lot of noticing, which when you described this to me, when I was like, oh, how do you do this? I think you naturally just have that radar.
I think back to people might think assertiveness is all about what you say. I think you can be assertive in how you direct a conversation. And
definitely.
even like how you start a meeting, for example, like the
Yes.
things we're trying to talk about today, how you close a meeting. So the actions we're going away with are like these like this, the framing, the direction of a discussion. I think people can come away from that meeting and still have a perception of someone being assertive, not for being the person who talked all the way through, but for the person who sort of directed the discussion. But I feel good about my assertiveness when it has enabled other people. Like when I'm like, I've made sure someone has spoken, and I think sometimes that is about making space for people. So actually, just before we move on, I just want to go back to a point that Danielle made. You're making space for them to kind of talk through. Or sometimes it's about maybe just giving them a little bit of confidence. Like, oh, Sarah, I can see you've got a thought. Would now be a good time to share it?
Yeah.
Just that little bit of a sort of bringing people in when they might not be brave enough to do it for themselves. And I feel good about my kind of contribution to a meeting, even if I've not been the person who's had sort of shared that thing.
Yeah, you're very good at that. And I see that as the reason why people would want to work with you and for you, like a big reason, because I think people would always feel listened to and that they mattered. And we know mattering is really important as part of a team dynamic. And it's like almost like a small action that you take that I think probably has a significant impact on how people feel.
Also, selfishly, it's a forcing function to stay engaged in meetings. Like, if you're ever like drifting off, if you think, do you know what, I'm just going to tune into other people so that I can include them. It keeps you very engaged in a meeting when that's your agenda.
So should we talk about the fourth watch out?
Yeah.
Where maybe you're not as brilliant as you are all the rest of the time, which is energy overload.
Yeah.
So when this happens, what do you think the impact is? Like, what do you think are the consequences of sort of too much energy flowing out of you?
I think this tends to happen at worst when I start a meeting, because if I'm not very managed about this, I'll start every meeting with energy, but sometimes too much of it, and it can come across a bit chaotic. And it's okay. I think I sometimes do this on Pod Plus, but I think they're all used to it now. And I'll just be like, hi everyone, oh my gosh, so much is happening at the moment. And it will just come out in like a flood. A stream of like, how are you all doing? Oh my gosh, what a crazy way. Like just a stream of updates and like it's just a bit of everything all at once.
Sometimes quite random, I would say. I've seen some quite random stuff.
Really random.
You sometimes message me and you're like, oh, zebras came up. And I'm like, how did zebras come up?
Because a collection of zebras is called a dazzle. That's how that came up.
Yeah, that's a real example.
That was a real example. So a bit random, a bit overwhelming. And I think for some people, but I would probably say the minority of people, there's a connection, an instant connection. But for the majority of people, particularly if they've not met me before, I think they're like, whoa, what? Yeah, a little bit. Whoa. And obviously that's not being assertive, because I think assertiveness is, you've created a credible connection with somebody, and so I think you can lose it in that moment. So I have to manage my energy, particularly in initial interactions, so it's not overwhelming for people.
And we were saying sometimes you felt like maybe it can come across as maybe a bit immature or out of sync or lacking gravitas.
Yes.
But this is one where we've really thought carefully about what we think the action should be, because I think there's an important point when you're thinking about assertiveness is you don't want to lose the you-ness.
Yeah.
So if you lose Helen bringing energy, that is one of Helen's strengths. It's also a value that she's got. It kind of really matters to her. So we don't sort of want to suck the joy out of how Helen shows up in those kind of interactions. So we're calling this action mirroring enough. So just mirroring would probably mean that you have to adapt so far that you're getting into pretending territory. You're like, I'm having to show up in a way that isn't authentic to me and doesn't feel like me. So that might mean that you met someone who was sort of very serious, very kind of introverted, maybe very slow paced. All of those things would be dramatically different to you. What we don't think is the right thing to do is say, well, I've suddenly got to be that person, be more someone else. I think actually it's about adapting enough so that you can kind of actually just sense, how can I use my energy in a useful way for this person and for this situation? And so I think at times your random extra energy is absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Like, and you were saying that, you were like, well, there are moments where it just doesn't, it's
fun.
It's quite fun.
Yeah.
And playful, and people probably need that in their weeks. But perhaps if you were meeting someone from a different culture, and perhaps if you're meeting 6 people who are all sitting around a board table in suits and look quite serious, zebra chat might not be the place to start.
Let's not talk about dazzles at that moment. Again, when I'm being intentional about my assertiveness, I will be looking at how people are responding. I'll maybe drop a quick question in, like, how are we? Or like something subtle at the start. And then depending on how people respond, it gives me a bit of data that helps me to think, well, kind of how do I need to mirror you sort of enough while retaining what makes me memorable in that situation. So it's the moments where I'm intentional about assertiveness that I'll kind of be more conscious about mirroring.
Yeah, I think it's just about looking for clues and cues about how can I be assertive in a way that works for me and also is going to be effective for other people. So the final watch out, which I think is actually really connected to 4 that we just talked about, is this thing about the robot risk. And the reason that we're both laughing quite early on with this one is we have seen this happen in action. Would you like to give the example, Helen?
Well, yes. So it's kind of weird, isn't it, that I could both have the over enthusiastic energy, and then I've also fallen into the trap of the robot one. So we were doing some filming with Penguin for,
I think it was Squiggly Careers.
We were in a studio.
I really remember the video though.
There were lots of cameras, and they wanted us to clearly and assertively communicate about Squiggly Careers in our book. And there was a bit of a script, and I think I was so busy thinking what I wanted to say and what words were going to be impactful and assertive that I said this script, and I basically lost all of when we watched it, but I don't think we quite realised in the moment, which was awful because you can't go back to a studio and re-record this stuff. It was like a moment in time.
It is weird that we didn't clock it at the time.
It's awful.
Because honestly, if you watch it back, you are talking like a robot. And it's so un-Helen-like.
Squiggly careers are really important for people's development, and we should all be... we have never used that content because it is so uninspiring.
I wonder, it probably exists somewhere if you look hard enough, but we won't look hard for it, I think that's for sure.
But yeah, so this robot, I think it happens maybe when you're nervous or when you're making assumptions that, you need to be very serious about stuff in order to be assertive.
I've seen it happen to people on stage.
Yeah.
Where they've had feedback around presenting to big groups and then they've gone really robotic, only from a sense of trying to get better and trying to take that feedback on board. But then they sort of lose all sense of who they are.
Yeah.
And there's no expression and there's no emotion.
Do you know what I saw it recently? I'm not going to name the event because I don't want it to, I don't want the person to be identified. But I was at a large event and there was somebody on stage who had mentioned that they'd done the same presentation a few times in different places.
Right.
And they stood on one spot and they basically spieled off their presentation. But I don't know whether they'd got so used to what they were saying and maybe
they just
bored.
reeled it off.
Maybe so bored by what they were saying. They'd lost that ability to sort of connect with the audience. It felt very robotic and it was really boring. That is the point with this. The person on the other end of the robot is bored by this. And so if this is your watch out, and there are lots of reasons why it might be your watch out, so please don't think we're being too harsh about it.
I think we're being harsh on ourselves.
Yeah, you might, you're harsh on me, maybe. You might be nervous or whatever. There might be lots of reasons why this is your watch out. But one of the easiest things to do is to start with some kind of empathy. So if you can create a connection with an audience about, how people are coming to you on that day, whether it's the start of a meeting or maybe it's a Monday morning and, it's after a bank holiday weekend or something. If you can start with empathy, it immediately create some kind of connection with the people that you are communicating with, and then they want to listen to you. You've reduced the risk of the robot because you've immediately created some kind of connection with your audience.
And we were saying we've seen people do this really brilliantly where it doesn't take a lot. This empathy could just be a kind of small moment of connection, of seeing the world through kind of your team's eyes or kind of just knowing what's going on for people right here, right now. And then actually people quite quickly can move into being quite assertive about, well, this is the focus, this is the priority, and communicating with actually a lot of clarity and really influencing and persuading people. But like you said, I think by that point, people are on board. They get me.
Yeah.
They understand how it feels right now. You actually did it in Squiggly Careers in Action, the new newsletter. You'd written the introduction this week, and you started it by saying, we just had a bank holiday here in the UK when we're recording this, and you said, hope you've all had a great bank holiday. I bet, like me, you're all coming back to those emails that you should have done on Thursday, and then you just decided could probably wait. And you're like, that's just a tiny moment where I read that and thought, yeah, I did that, as did probably everybody else. And then you talked about actually our podcast interview with Tasha Yorick. So you went much more sort of to the point, you should watch this is why, you're being assertive in your communication. But it's just a small moment of empathy that then I think, like you say, gets people on board.
It's quite a nice example of this can happen in an email just as much as it can on a stage as well. So they are all of our watch outs. So really this is about tuning into what is my watch out and then taking the action that's going to help you improve your assertiveness. And that's quite an individual reflection, individual action for all of us. But hopefully we've given you enough to get started.
As always, if you've got any feedback, you can email us. We're Helen and Sarah at squigglycareers.com. We love hearing your ideas, guests that you'd like to hear from, or just any feedback on how these episodes are helping you. But that's everything for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back with you again soon. Bye for now.